Welcome back to another deep dive into the darkest corners of Fallout lore. Today's story takes us beneath the Nevada desert to kingdoms you never knew existed, ruled by dynasties that made Vault-Tec look humanitarian by comparison. This is the confession of Marcus Thorne, the fourth, the god king who rejected his throne, freed his subjects, and now wanders the wasteland, warning about the Desert Pharaohs still preparing to emerge from their underground empires. The lore begins now. My name is Marcus Thorne IV, and everything you think you know about who survived the Great War is wrong. Everyone talks about Mr. House and his lucky 38, about the Brotherhood of Steel emerging from hidden bunkers, about Vault-Tec saving a chosen few. But nobody asks the right questions. Nobody wonders why, between 2050 and 2076, 17 of America's wealthiest people quietly purchased massive tracts of Nevada desert for prices that would make your head spin. Nobody questions what they buried 300 feet beneath the sand before October 23rd, 2077. I was born in the Osiris complex, 300 feet under Death Valley, in a place my family told me was heaven itself. For 16 years, I believed them. I believed my great-grandfather, Marcus Thorne, was a living god. I believed the 10,000 people who bowed before our family's throne were the faithful remnants of humanity. I believed the surface world had been scorched into permanent hell, and only we, the chosen dynasty, had escaped divine judgment. The truth is so much stranger and so much worse. Let me take you back to 2051, 26 years before the bombs fell. My great-grandfather, Marcus Thorne, had just turned 43 years old. He'd made his first billion at 30 founding Thorne Dynamics Corporation, a tech company that specialized in advanced materials engineering and automated construction systems. By 2050, he was worth $8.2 billion, with government contracts spanning from the Department of Defense to the Atomic Energy Commission. He was powerful, he was connected, and he was terrified. See, people like my grandfather didn't get rich by being stupid. They got rich by reading the signs everyone else missed. And by 2050, every sign pointed to the same conclusion. Nuclear annihilation wasn't a possibility, it was inevitable. The resource wars had been grinding on for years. The Sino-American conflict was escalating monthly. Oil reserves were running dry. The world wasn't heading toward the edge, it was already falling. That's when the first whispers started, quiet conversations in private clubs, encrypted communications between CEO penthouses. My grandfather kept detailed records, recordings I'd discovered decades later in the archive chamber. He documented everything, including the night of May 14th, 2051, when 18 of America's wealthiest individuals gathered in a private suite at the Lucky 38 Casino in Las Vegas. Robert House was there, of course. The man who would later save Las Vegas from nuclear fire already knew what was coming. He'd run his mathematical projections, calculated the exact date the bombs would fall, but House was the pragmatist of the group. He wanted to save his city, preserve civilization, rebuild humanity. He thought small. The others, the ones who would become the Desert Pharaohs, they thought bigger. They thought forever. My grandfather recorded that meeting on a holotape I'd find hidden in our family's deepest vault. His voice, younger then, filled with an enthusiasm that still makes my stomach turn. "Gentlemen and ladies," he said, "Robert proposes we save Las Vegas. Noble, practical, safe. But I ask you, why save just a city? Why settle for surviving when we could rule? Why emerge as equals when we could emerge as gods?" The room went silent on that recording. Then someone laughed. Helena Vasquez, pharmaceutical magnate, heir to the largest drug manufacturing empire in North America. "Go on, Marcus," she said. "Tell us how we become gods." That's when my grandfather laid out what he called the Desert Pharaoh Initiative. The concept was simple, audacious, and absolutely insane. Each of them would purchase enormous tracts of Nevada desert, thousands of square miles of land nobody wanted. Then they'd excavate complexes deep underground, not mere bunkers or vaults, but cities, underground kingdoms, places where they could wait out not just the immediate aftermath of nuclear war, but decades, even centuries, places where they could build societies from scratch, societies where they would be worshipped as divine rulers, where their descendants would reign as living gods over populations bred and conditioned to serve. The bombs will fall, my grandfather told them. We all know this. Vault-Tec knows this. The government knows this. So the question isn't whether we survive. The question is how we emerge. Do we crawl out of our holes as refugees, grateful for scraps? Or do we descend into our kingdoms as gods and emerge 200 years later with armies of faithful subjects, with technology preserved and perfected, with the power to remake the world exactly as we see fit? 12 of the 18 people at that meeting said yes. 5 walked away, including Robert House, who apparently told my grandfather, "You're not trying to save humanity, Marcus. You're trying to replace it. Count me out." House would go on to protect Las Vegas with his Securitron army and missile defense systems. My grandfather would go on to build a tomb. If you're still with me after hearing this, hit that like and subscribe button. Between 2051 and 2076, my grandfather spent $4.2 billion on the Osiris complex. He purchased 2,400 square miles of Death Valley for $850 million, officially for geothermal research and advanced materials testing. The government didn't ask questions. They were too busy preparing for war, too distracted by Vault-Tec's promises and the Enclave's secret plans. The excavation began in 2053. Automated construction systems, the same technology Thorn Dynamics had sold to the military for building underground missile silos, carved out 47 levels beneath the desert floor. Each level was the size of a small town. The deepest levels, where my family would eventually rule, sat 370 feet below the surface, protected by layers of reinforced concrete, lead shielding, and advanced defense systems that made Vault-Tec's security look primitive. But the Osiris complex wasn't just about survival. It was about control, about creating a civilization that would worship my family as gods. My grandfather didn't just build rooms and corridors. He built temples. He built throne rooms modeled after Egyptian palaces. He built artificial sky projection systems that displayed eternal golden sunlight. He built genetic modification facilities. He built religious indoctrination centers. And he recruited his subjects carefully, not through force, but through desperation. Starting in 2060, Thorn Dynamics began offering survival contracts to its employees. Sign over your life, your family's lives, your children's children's lives to the Thorn Dynasty for perpetuity and beyond. And in exchange, you'd be guaranteed a spot in our advanced survival facility. People signed, thousands of them. Corporate employees facing layoffs, families terrified of the coming war. True believers who saw my grandfather's charisma and wealth as proof of divine favor. By 2070, the Osiris complex had 12,000 inhabitants living in its completed sections, already being conditioned, already being taught that Marcus Thorn was not just their employer, not just their benefactor, but their God King. That the surface world was already damned, that only perfect obedience to the Thorn dynasty would ensure their salvation. I learned these details from the archive chamber, where my father took me on my 16th birthday. Before that day, I'd believed everything they taught me. I believed my great-grandfather had saved 10,000 souls through his divine wisdom. I believed the sun god we worshipped was literal divinity made flesh. I believed our underground kingdom, with its golden artificial skies and hydroponic gardens, producing what we called divine manna, was heaven itself. The archive chamber shattered everything. Row after row of holotapes, thousands of pages of contracts, surveillance footage from before the war showing desperate people signing documents they barely understood. My father made me watch it all, made me see the truth of what we were. "You need to understand what we really are," he told me, his voice hollow. "Your great-grandfather didn't save these people. He bought them. He owned them, and when the bombs fell on October 23rd, 2077, he sealed them inside a tomb and told them it was paradise. But my grandfather wasn't alone in this madness. That's what makes it worse. The other desert pharaohs were building their own kingdoms throughout Nevada. Helena Vasquez constructed what she called the Pyramid of Eternal Youth beneath Mercury, Nevada. Her complex held 15,000 subjects and featured the most advanced genetic engineering facilities outside of government control. She was obsessed with immortality, with perfecting the human form. Her subjects weren't just conditioned to worship her, they were genetically modified, their DNA altered to be more beautiful, more obedient, more perfect. The recordings my father showed me from surveillance drones that spied on nearby complexes revealed what happened when Vasquez's experiments went wrong. The Pyramid of Eternal Youth collapsed in 2241, torn apart from within by genetic mutations that turned her perfect specimens into something inhuman. Jonathan Park, the software genius who revolutionized artificial intelligence, built the digital afterlife beneath Black Rock Desert. Park didn't just want to survive the war, he wanted to transcend humanity entirely. His complex featured a massive supercomputer array where he uploaded his consciousness, then ruled his 8,000 subjects through hundreds of robotic avatars. He claimed to have achieved digital immortality, to have become a god of pure information. Whether he was right or simply insane, nobody knows. Frederick Sinclair was supposed to be one of us. He attended the early planning meetings, pledged to build his own pharaoh complex, but somewhere along the way, he changed. He fell in love with some starlet named Vera Keys and ruined everything by building the Sierra Madre for her instead of for power. The other pharaohs considered him a traitor to the vision, but really, he was just the only one who remembered he was human. Do you know what it's like to discover you're not divine? That you're just the descendant of a billionaire who played God? I was 16 years old, standing in the archive chamber, watching holotapes of my great-grandfather laughing about how easy it was to make people worship him. Give them security, give them purpose, give them spectacle, he said in one recording, and they'll call you anything you want. Provider, leader, God. The genetic modification program started in 2065, 11 years before my great-grandfather predicted the bombs would fall. He brought in scientists from Big Mountain, from West-Tec, from private research firms that didn't ask questions as long as the checks cleared. The goal wasn't just to survive radiation or extend lifespan. The goal was to create a literally superior bloodline, to give the Thorn dynasty biological proof of our divine right to rule. My father showed me the medical records. 3 generations of Thorns, including himself, had undergone genetic enhancement in utero, extended telomeres for longer life, enhanced bone density, optimized metabolism, alterations to facial structure based on classical ideals of beauty, even modifications to neurotransmitter production to enhance charisma and leadership presence. My great-grandfather wanted to create a family that looked like gods, lived like gods, and ruled like gods. It worked, to an extent. The average Thorn lives 140 to 160 years. We're taller, stronger, more symmetrical than baseline humans. We have this presence that makes people listen when we speak. But we're not gods. We're just genetically modified descendants of a madman with too much money and too little conscience. The religious programming went deeper than I ever imagined. Starting from birth, every child in the Osiris complex was taught the sacred history, how the surface world had been consumed by sin and nuclear fire, how the sun god Marcus Thorn, through his infinite wisdom and divine power, had preserved the faithful in his underground paradise, how his bloodline carried literal divinity, passed from father to son, generation to generation, how perfect obedience to the Thorn dynasty was the only path to eternal salvation. They had priests, actual priests who conducted daily ceremonies praising my family. They had sacred texts, beautifully illuminated books proclaiming my great-grandfather's divinity. They had rituals where subjects would bring tribute to our throne room, offerings of their finest work, their most beautiful art, genetic samples from their healthiest children for our divine selection programs. I participated in these ceremonies for 16 years before I knew the truth. I accepted worship from people who genuinely believed I was a god incarnate. I sat on a throne of gold and platinum while 10,000 subjects prostrated themselves before me. I genuinely thought I deserved it, that my family's divine nature made us worthy of such devotion. The worst part? Some part of me still remembers how good it felt, how intoxicating it was to be worshipped. That's the insidious thing about power like that. It corrupts you from the inside, makes you want to believe the lies even after you know they're false. My father explained the summit of 2070 during my education in the archive chamber. All 17 surviving Desert Pharaohs met in secret that year, along with Robert House, to discuss the coming war. They knew it was close. House's projections gave them less than a decade. The question on the table was simple. Should they warn the government? Should they try to prevent the nuclear holocaust they knew was coming? House voted yes. He wanted to save Las Vegas, to preserve as much of civilization as possible. He argued that even if they couldn't prevent the war entirely, they could minimize the damage, give humanity a better chance at recovery. The other pharaohs listened politely, then voted 16-1 against him. My grandfather's reasoning was recorded in the summit minutes. If we prevent the war, we lose everything. Our complexes become expensive bunkers instead of kingdoms. Our subjects realize they were never in danger, demand to leave, expose what we've built. But if the world burns as we know it will, we become exactly what we've told our people we are: saviors, prophets, gods. The war validates everything we've promised. Why would we give that up to save a civilization that's already failed? Robert House left that meeting in disgust. He went on to save Las Vegas anyway, to build his Securitron army and missile defense grid. He emerged from the war as a practical autocrat, controlling New Vegas through technological superiority and economic leverage. He never claimed to be a god. He was just a man who refused to let his city die. The Desert Pharaohs, by contrast, sealed themselves in their underground kingdoms and waited for the world to burn so they could emerge as deities. The bombs fell on October 23, 2077 at 9:47 a.m. Pacific Time. I've watched the surveillance footage 100 times. The Osiris Complex's external cameras captured the distant flashes on the horizon as warheads struck Los Angeles, San Diego, Phoenix. Our defensive systems activated automatically, our blast doors sealed, our life support engaged. We were built to survive direct hits. We didn't get any. Death Valley was too remote, too worthless to waste nukes on. But my great-grandfather had planned for this moment. The instant the bombs fell, he activated what he called the Ascension Protocol. All external communications were cut. The artificial sky projections shifted to display scenes of nuclear fire consuming the surface world. Carefully edited footage, some real, some fabricated, showed cities burning, people dying, the earth transformed into an irradiated hellscape. Then came the first grand ceremony of salvation. My great-grandfather, 90 years old, but genetically enhanced to look 60, stood before his 10,000 subjects in the great temple and proclaimed that his divine vision had saved them all, that the sinful surface world had been judged and found wanting, that only here in his blessed kingdom beneath the earth could humanity survive. And they believed him. They wept with gratitude. They sang hymns of praise. They offered prayers of thanksgiving that the sun god had chosen them, had preserved them, had brought them to paradise while the wicked burned above. From that moment on, the Osiris complex wasn't just a bunker, it was heaven. And my family weren't just survivors, we were gods. The genetic selection program intensified after the war. My great-grandfather wanted to breed the perfect servant class, people genetically optimized for loyalty, intelligence, physical capability, and submission to authority. The archive chamber contained detailed records of the breeding programs, arranged marriages based on genetic compatibility, children removed from parents who showed insufficient devotion to the dynasty. They created a genetics database of every person in the Osiris complex. They tracked bloodlines 6 generations deep. They identified desirable traits like intelligence, creativity, physical strength, and beauty, then systematically bred people like livestock to concentrate those traits. Undesirable traits, things like independent thinking or questioning authority, were bred out through selective reproduction and genetic counseling. By my time, 200 years later, the population of the Osiris complex was almost unrecognizable compared to the original inhabitants. Generations of selective breeding had created people who were smarter, stronger, more beautiful than baseline humans, but they'd also created a population psychologically incapable of questioning the Thorn dynasty. Obedience was literally in their DNA. I met a surface ghoul in 2276 during a reconnaissance mission my father sent me on. We had drones and surveillance systems monitoring the Mojave Wasteland, tracking the NCR's expansion, watching the Brotherhood of Steel move through the region. But my father wanted me to see the surface world with my own eyes, to understand what we'd be emerging into. The ghoul's name was Marcus, same as my great-grandfather, which felt like some kind of cosmic joke. He'd been a soldier before the war, fought in Anchorage, survived the initial blasts through sheer luck. When I told him about the Osiris complex, about my family's underground kingdom, he laughed so hard he had to sit down. "Of course," he wheezed. "Of course those crazy billionaires built god kingdoms. That's the most American thing I've ever heard. You know what's funny? Your granddaddy and his friends probably spent more money on those complexes than it would have cost to actually prevent the war. But prevention doesn't stroke the ego, does it? Can't be a god if there's no apocalypse to save people from." His words stuck with me. My great-grandfather had the resources to warn people, to fund shelters, to maybe even influence policy toward peace. Instead, he'd spent billions creating a place where he could play deity, where he could own people, body and soul, and have them thank him for it. The communication networks between the pharaoh complexes operated on old military frequencies, heavily encrypted. I discovered them by accident at age 17, searching through restricted archive sections my father hadn't shown me. The Desert Pharaohs had been in contact the entire time, sharing technology, trading genetic samples from their subject populations, coordinating their emergence timeline. The messages revealed complexes I'd never heard of. The Anubis Vault beneath the Iamargosa Desert, ruled by the Chen dynasty, specializing in advanced weapons development. The Luxor underworld near the old Nevada test sites, where the Rashid family had built a complex holding 20,000 subjects and spent 2 centuries perfecting fusion technology. The Serpent Temple in the Black Rock Desert, where the Kim family had created an entire religion worshipping technology as divine manifestation. But the messages also revealed the failures. 3 complexes had collapsed by 2277. The Pyramid of Eternal Youth, torn apart by genetic mutations in 2241. The Atlas Complex, lost to civil war in 2189 when subjects discovered the truth and rebelled against their gods. The Cronus Bunker, destroyed in 2256 when its fusion reactor melted down, irradiating everything within a 2-mile radius. The Desert Pharaohs were dying out, one by one, but the survivors were preparing to emerge, to claim the wasteland as their divine inheritance. If this story has kept you listening this far, and you want more of these dark confessions from the wasteland, hit that like button. It really motivates me to create similar Fallout lores. My great-grandfather died in 2140, 133 years old, his genetically enhanced body finally failing despite every medical technology we possessed. I never met him, but I've seen hundreds of hours of recordings. He spent his final years obsessed with the emergence timeline, with ensuring his descendants would rule for 10,000 years. His last holotape recording, made 3 days before his death, shows a withered old man propped up in his bed, surrounded by priests and family members. His voice was weak, but his words were clear. "I have built a dynasty that will last until the sun dies," he whispered. "My children's children's children will emerge from this place as gods, as pharaohs, as immortal rulers of a reborn world. The Thorn dynasty will remake civilization in its image, and every human being who survives will kneel before our throne. This is my gift to you, my descendants. This is my legacy. Rule well, rule forever. Never let them forget what you are. Never let them forget they exist only to serve." The priests called it a divine prophecy. The archive chamber labeled it the terminal delusions of a narcissistic billionaire who'd convinced himself his own propaganda. My father never told me which interpretation he believed. The succession rituals were elaborate, designed to reinforce our divine status with every generation. When my father took the throne at age 30, he underwent 3 months of genetic enhancement treatments, consciousness uploading to backup systems, and public ceremonies where every subject in the Osiris complex witnessed his divine ascension. They called it the rite of solar inheritance. The old pharaoh would symbolically pass the divine flame to his heir in the great temple. The heir would undergo enhancement in the sacred medical chambers while priests chanted and subjects prayed. Then, the new pharaoh would emerge, transformed by divine power, to accept worship from his people. It was theater, expensive, technologically advanced theater designed to make genetically modified humans look like gods. But it worked. Generation after generation, the subjects believed. They had no reason not to. They'd never seen the surface world, never met anyone outside our complex, never encountered any information that contradicted the sacred history we'd taught them since birth. I discovered the prison levels when I was 18 years old, exploring restricted sections of the Osiris complex that even my father rarely visited. Level 43, 320 feet beneath the desert floor, contained what the official records called rehabilitation facilities. The reality was far darker. Cells, hundreds of them, carved into solid rock, sealed behind reinforced doors with electronic locks. Most were empty by my time, but the archive chamber held records going back 2 centuries. Thousands of names. Thousands of people who'd been sent down here for crimes against the dynasty. What crimes? Questioning our divinity, remembering too much about pre-war America, teaching their children unauthorized history, attempting to access restricted information, trying to leave the complex. The prison levels existed to disappear anyone who threatened the carefully constructed reality we'd built. The archive chamber contained interrogation recordings. I made myself watch them, even though every instinct screamed to look away. People strapped to chairs, subjected to hours of questioning about why they doubted, why they questioned, why they'd failed to maintain proper faith. Many broke, recanted their heresy, were released back into the general population after rehabilitation. Others disappeared into deeper cells and never emerged. The worst recordings were the recent ones, from just decades before my birth. A woman named Sarah Chen, arrested in 2254 for teaching her daughter that the Thorn family were just people, not gods. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. She never recanted. The final entry in her file simply read, "Subject proved resistant to rehabilitation. Terminated." My father found me in the archive chamber that night, tears streaming down my face as I watched recording after recording of people being broken or killed for the crime of thinking clearly. "Now you understand," he said quietly, sitting beside me. "Now you know what we really are. Not gods, not saviors, prison wardens ruling over people who don't even know they're prisoners." "Why?" I asked him. "Why do you continue this? You know the truth. You've known for years. Why not just tell them?" He was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "Because I'm a coward. Because I've lived my entire life accepting worship, and I don't know how to be anything else. Because 10,000 people believe I'm a god, and if I tell them the truth, their entire world collapses, and because I genuinely don't know if they'd survive the truth, if they could rebuild their identities after learning everything they believed was a lie." That conversation haunted me for years. My father knew we were monsters, but he couldn't stop being one. He'd inherited a system built on lies and oppression, and he was too afraid to dismantle it, too comfortable in his role, too addicted to the power. The other Desert Pharaohs were preparing for emergence. The communication networks buzzed with encrypted messages throughout 2276 and 2277. The digital afterlife was ready to deploy its robotic armies. The Anubis Vault had perfected weapons that made plasma rifles look primitive. The Luxor underworld had cracked advanced fusion technology and was manufacturing power cores that could run a city for centuries. They'd waited 200 years, perfecting their technology, breeding their armies of devoted subjects, preparing for the day they'd emerge as conquering god kings. The wasteland had stabilized enough. The NCR had built a functioning republic. Caesar's legion had united the East under brutal military rule. Mr. House controlled New Vegas. The world was ready to be conquered by people who'd spent 2 centuries preparing for exactly that. The emergence timeline called for 2277, exactly 200 years after the Great War. Symbolic, meaningful, a new era beginning, with the Desert Pharaohs ascending to rule the rebuilt world. But first, we needed to understand what we were emerging into. My father sent me on extended reconnaissance missions starting in 2275 when I was 20 years old. I spent months on the surface, disguised as a wasteland wanderer, observing the NCR, watching the Brotherhood of Steel, studying the various factions and settlements. I met people who'd built lives from nothing, communities that had survived through cooperation and mutual aid, traders who risked their lives running caravans between settlements, families farming irradiated soil, making it productive through sheer determination. They weren't waiting for gods to save them. They'd saved themselves. I met NCR soldiers who believed in democracy, in laws, in rebuilding civilization through representation and shared governance. I met Brotherhood scribes who preserved technology not to hoard it for power, but because they genuinely believed knowledge was humanity's best hope. I met doctors and teachers and engineers working to make the wasteland better, not because anyone commanded them to, but because they chose to. And I realized the Desert Pharaohs were preparing to destroy all of it, to sweep in with our superior technology and our armies of genetically enhanced believers and impose our rule on people who'd built their own civilizations without us, to replace democracy with theocracy, freedom with worship, self-determination with divine monarchy. I returned to the Osiris complex in early 2277, 3 months before my scheduled coronation. My father was dying, his enhanced genetics finally failing at 140 years old. The succession rituals were already being prepared. The priests were writing new hymns. The genetic enhancement facilities were being prepared for my divine transformation. I was supposed to take the throne of eternal light, accept the worship of 10,000 subjects who believed I was literally divine, and lead them to the surface to claim our destiny as God Kings of the wasteland. Instead, I spent those 3 months in the archive chamber, reviewing every file, every recording, every piece of evidence of what we really were. I made copies of everything, stored them in portable data drives. I wanted proof. I wanted to be able to show people the truth, to demonstrate beyond any doubt that the Thorn dynasty were not gods, just the descendants of a billionaire who'd built an elaborate prison. My father died in his sleep on June 18th, 2277. The priests called it divine transcendence, claimed his spirit had returned to the eternal sun to watch over us. The archive chamber recorded it as heart failure, the inevitable result of genetic modifications that had extended his life far beyond natural limits, but couldn't make him immortal. The funeral lasted 3 days. 10,000 subjects mourned their god Pharaoh. They wept, they prayed, they brought tribute to his tomb, a massive chamber carved from solid gold, decorated with murals depicting his supposed divine deeds. They genuinely loved him, these people he'd spent his life deceiving. That's when I understood the full tragedy of what we'd done. We hadn't just imprisoned these people's bodies, we'd imprisoned their minds, their hearts, their capacity for independent thought, and they loved us for it. They were grateful for their chains because we'd convinced them the chains were heaven. My coronation was scheduled for July 4th, 2277. Another symbolic date, Independence Day in the old America, though nobody in the Osiris complex remembered that. For them, it would be the day of my divine ascension, the day I became the fourth sun god of the Thorn dynasty. The ceremony required me to undergo genetic enhancement in the sacred medical chambers, while 10,000 subjects watched through projection screens throughout the complex. Then I'd emerge, supposedly transformed by divine power, to accept their worship in the great temple. The genetic enhancements were real enough, advanced modifications that would extend my lifespan another 50 years, optimize my physical capabilities, enhance my already modified DNA. The consciousness uploading was real too, creating backup copies of my mind in case my body ever failed. My great-grandfather had started that tradition, trying to achieve a form of immortality through technology. But the divine transformation was theater. I'd go into the medical facility as Marcus Thorn IV, receive technological enhancements, and emerge hours later as the living sun, divine pharaoh of the Osiris complex, God incarnate deserving of absolute worship and obedience. I stood in my chambers the night before the coronation, looking at the ceremonial robes they'd prepared for me, gold and platinum thread embedded with actual diamonds, worth more than most wasteland settlements combined. A crown modeled after ancient Egyptian pharaohs, updated with holographic projections that made it appear to radiate light. A scepter embedded with a functional plasma weapon, because even our religious symbols doubled as instruments of control. My father's last words to me, spoken hours before his death, echoed in my mind. "You can be better than us," he'd whispered. "You can end this. I never had the courage, but maybe you do. Maybe you can set them free." I'd asked him what he meant. He just smiled, squeezed my hand, and closed his eyes for the last time. Now I understood. He'd seen what I'd seen on the surface. He'd known that the emergence would be conquest, not salvation. He'd recognized that we were planning to destroy the very civilizations we'd spent 2 centuries claiming we'd rebuild. And he'd been too afraid, too complicit, too addicted to power to stop it himself. But he'd hoped I might be different. The other Desert Pharaohs were ready. I'd intercepted their communications. The digital afterlife was deploying robotic scouts throughout the Mojave. The Anubis Vault was positioning weapons platforms near major NCR settlements. The Luxor underworld had begun preliminary negotiations with Caesar's Legion, offering advanced technology in exchange for territorial concessions. They were coordinating a simultaneous emergence across Nevada. 14 remaining pharaoh complexes, each with populations between 5,000 and 20,000 genetically enhanced, technologically advanced, fanatically loyal subjects. Total military strength estimated at over 60,000 soldiers equipped with weapons and armor that made the Brotherhood of Steel look primitive. The plan was simple: emerge at strategic locations, demonstrate overwhelming technological superiority, offer the existing factions a choice, submit to divine rule or be destroyed, use superior weapons, genetic enhancements, and religious fanaticism to crush any resistance. Within a year, the Desert Pharaohs expected to control Nevada. Within 5 years, the entire Western wasteland. Within 20 years, all of post-war America. And it might have worked. The technology was real. The weapons were devastating. The loyalty of our subjects was absolute. The NCR couldn't match our weapons. The Legion couldn't match our organization. The Brotherhood couldn't match our numbers. Mr. House controlled only Vegas, a single city against our underground empire. But I'd seen what we'd be destroying. I'd met the people we'd be enslaving. I'd watched communities built on hope and cooperation, not fear and worship. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't lead that conquest. I couldn't become the monster my great-grandfather had designed me to be. The morning of July 4th, 2277, I walked into the great temple where 10,000 subjects waited to witness my divine ascension. The priests stood ready to begin the ceremony. The genetic enhancement facilities were prepared. The throne waited for its new god king. I stood before my people, these people who'd lived their entire lives believing lies my family had told them, and I spoke words that shattered 2 centuries of carefully constructed mythology. "My name is Marcus Thorne IV," I said, my voice broadcast throughout every level of the Osiris complex. "And I am not a god. My family has never been divine. We are descendants of a pre-war billionaire who built this place not to save you but to own you. Everything you've been taught about the sacred history is a lie. Everything you believe about our divine nature is false. The surface world isn't hell, it's rebuilding, and you're not the faithful remnants of humanity. You're prisoners who've been deceived for 200 years. The silence that followed was absolute. 10,000 people stared at me in shock, confusion, horror. Some began to weep. Others shouted denials. The priests called for my arrest, claiming I'd been corrupted by surface demons. But I'd prepared for this. I activated the projection systems and began playing footage from the archive chamber. My great-grandfather's recordings admitting the complexes were about power, not salvation. Surveillance footage of the prison levels, interrogation recordings, genetic modification records showing we'd bred people like livestock, 200 years of documentation proving every word I'd said was true. "You have a choice," I continued over the chaos. "You can stay here in this underground prison, waiting for new pharaohs to continue the lies. Or you can leave. The main gates are opening. The surface world exists. It's dangerous. It's harsh, but it's real, and you're free to see it for yourselves." The psychological break was immediate and catastrophic. People who'd spent their entire lives believing they lived in heaven, served by divine rulers, protected from a hellish surface world, suddenly confronted with proof that everything was a lie. Some collapsed where they stood. Others screamed. Many simply stood frozen, unable to process what they'd just learned. The priests tried to maintain order, claiming I'd been possessed by demons, that the footage was surface world trickery designed to corrupt the faithful. But I'd anticipated their response. I'd given access codes to several high-ranking technical specialists, people who'd always seemed more curious than their conditioning allowed. They verified the footage was real, pulled directly from our own archive systems, unaltered and authentic. The great temple descended into chaos. Arguments broke out between those who accepted the truth and those who clung desperately to their beliefs. Families divided. Friends turned against each other. Some subjects attacked the priests, decades of suppressed doubt suddenly erupting into rage. Others attacked me, screaming that I was a heretic destroying their paradise. Security forces arrived within minutes, but they were as confused as everyone else. Their training said to protect the Thorne dynasty, but half of them had just learned the dynasty was built on lies. Their commander, a man named David Reeves, who'd served my father for 50 years, stood before me with his weapon drawn, tears streaming down his face. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice breaking. "All of it? The sacred history? Your divine nature? My entire life serving your family? Was it all a lie?" "Yes," I told him simply. "I'm sorry, David. You deserved better. Everyone here deserved better, but it was all lies from the beginning." He lowered his weapon. Then he turned to his security team and said, "Stand down. No one moves against him. He's telling the truth. I can see it in his eyes. We've all been fools. The main gates had never been opened from the inside since 2077. They were designed to withstand nuclear blasts, to keep the surface world out and our subjects in. The mechanisms were ancient, pre-war technology, maintained but never used. When I activated the opening sequence, warning klaxons blared throughout the complex. The gates were massive, 20 feet thick, composed of steel and concrete reinforced with advanced alloys. They opened slowly, grinding against mechanisms that hadn't moved in 2 centuries. As they swung open, Nevada sunlight poured into the complex for the first time since the bombs fell. Real sunlight. Not artificial projections showing eternal golden skies. Real light from the actual sun, harsh and bright and absolutely genuine. People gathered at the entrance, staring at the light streaming in. Some shielded their eyes, having never seen anything so bright. Others reached toward it like they were touching something sacred. Many just stood and wept, overwhelmed by the reality of a world they'd been told no longer existed. I walked out first, stepping onto Death Valley sand for the first time as the acknowledged heir of the Thorn dynasty. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, scorching hot even in early July morning. The landscape was harsh, unforgiving, and nothing like the hellscape we'd taught them to expect. "This is the surface world," I called back to the crowd gathering at the entrance. "This is the earth our ancestors survived on. It's dangerous, it's difficult, but it's real, and you're free to walk on it if you choose." Some followed immediately, stepping out onto the sand with expressions of wonder and terror. Others hung back, still afraid, still conditioned by 2 centuries of indoctrination to believe the surface would kill them instantly. A few turned and fled back into the depths of the complex, unable to accept what they were seeing. Over the next 3 days, approximately 7,000 of our 10,000 subjects chose to leave the Osiris complex. Some went in groups, families and friends who decided to face the wasteland together. Others left alone, striking out into the desert with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a desperate need to see what the world had become. About 3,000 chose to stay. Some were elderly, too old to adapt to a completely new reality. Others were true believers who couldn't abandon their faith even confronted with proof it was false. And some were simply too afraid, too psychologically damaged by 2 centuries of conditioning to function outside the only world they'd ever known. I stayed with them for a week, helping those who remained understand how to operate the complex's systems, how to manage the hydroponic farms and fusion reactors, how to survive without pharaohs ruling over them. I left them with all the technical documentation, all the resources they'd need. Then I sealed the gates behind me and walked away from the only home I'd ever known. The other Desert Pharaohs were furious. The communication networks exploded with encrypted messages demanding to know what I'd done, calling me a traitor to the vision, threatening everything from excommunication to assassination. Jonathan Park of the Digital Afterlife was particularly vicious, sending multiple transmissions claiming I'd betrayed the Ascension and destroyed 2 centuries of careful preparation. But my actions had consequences beyond just the Osiris complex. Word spread quickly through the remaining pharaoh complexes. Subjects who'd never questioned their divine rulers suddenly had proof that at least one dynasty was willing to admit the truth. Doubt spread like radiation through underground kingdoms built on certainty. The Serpent Temple experienced a revolt in September 2277. Subjects who'd heard about the Osiris complex demanded their own freedom. The Kim dynasty responded with force, using their security systems to suppress the uprising. 300 people died before order was restored, but the damage was done. The Serpent Temple's subjects now knew their gods could bleed. The Luxor underworld faced similar problems. The Rashid family tried to contain information about the Osiris complex, but their technical specialists had monitoring systems connected to the same communication networks I'd used. When those specialists shared what they'd learned, approximately 4,000 subjects demanded to leave. The Rashid dynasty negotiated a compromise, allowing those who wanted to leave to do so in exchange for pledges of secrecy about the complex's location. The digital afterlife took a different approach. Jonathan Park, now a distributed consciousness inhabiting hundreds of robotic bodies, simply killed anyone who questioned his divinity. Over 1,000 subjects were terminated in what he called debugging corrupted faith protocols. I wandered the Mojave wasteland for months after leaving the Osiris complex, trying to understand what I'd become. I wasn't a god. I'd rejected that identity, destroyed it publicly and irrevocably, but I wasn't really human either, was I? I was genetically modified to be superior, enhanced to live far longer than baseline humans, conditioned from birth to rule. What was I if not a god, and not quite human? I met a caravan trader named Sarah in November 2277, running goods between New Vegas and NCR territory. When I told her my story, she laughed and said, "Kid, you're overthinking this. You're just a person who was born into a messed up situation and did the right thing when you could. That's more human than most people manage." Her words helped, but they couldn't erase what I knew. The other Desert Pharaohs were still out there, still preparing to emerge, still planning to conquer the wasteland in the name of divine right. And I was the only one who'd rejected that path, the only one who knew their full capabilities and their exact plans. I started warning people in late 2277. I went to the NCR, told them about the underground kingdoms preparing to emerge from Nevada's deserts. They didn't believe me at first. Underground cities ruled by billionaire dynasties who thought they were gods? It sounded like wasteland legend, like ghost stories traders told around campfires. But I had evidence, data drives from the archive chamber, recordings of my great-grandfather, communication logs between the pharaoh complexes, detailed maps showing the approximate locations of the 14 remaining kingdoms, technical specifications for their weapons and defense systems. The NCR Intelligence Division took my information seriously once they verified it was genuine. They began monitoring the desert regions I'd identified, watching for signs of emergence, preparing contingencies for underground kingdoms they'd never known existed. I went to the Brotherhood of Steel next. They were even more skeptical than the NCR, but Elder McNamara understood the technological implications immediately. Pre-war weapons development, advanced genetic engineering, fusion technology beyond anything the Brotherhood had preserved. If even half of what I told them was true, the Desert Pharaohs represented both a massive threat and an unparalleled opportunity to recover lost technology. If this confession meant something to you, leave a like. It's the only way I know you liked the video. Mr. House was the hardest to convince, partly because he'd known about the Desert Pharaohs all along. When I finally gained an audience with him, at the Lucky 38, he greeted me with, "Ah, young Mr. Thorne, I wondered if any of you would eventually reject your grandfather's madness. Took you long enough." He'd attended the original summit of 2051, witnessed the birth of the Desert Pharaoh Initiative, and thought they were all insane. Your grandfather and his colleagues were brilliant people who confused wealth with wisdom and survival with divinity, House told me. I built New Vegas to preserve civilization. They built tombs and called them kingdoms. The difference is profound. House provided me with additional intelligence on the remaining pharaoh complexes, information his surveillance systems had gathered over 2 centuries. He'd been monitoring them the entire time, watching for signs they might threaten his city. Now, he shared that data freely, recognizing that someone from inside the pharaoh dynasties, warning the surface world, was unprecedented and valuable. By early 2278, I'd become a known figure in the Mojave, the former god king who'd freed his subjects and now traveled the wasteland warning about underground empires. Some people believed me, others thought I was insane, another wasteland crazy with delusions of grandeur. Most just didn't care, too focused on their own survival to worry about theoretical threats from beneath the desert. But I kept warning them, anyway, because I'd seen the weapons in the Anubis Vault. I'd reviewed the genetic enhancement programs breeding super soldiers in the Luxor underworld. I'd read the emergence plans calling for systematic conquest of the entire Western wasteland. The first major emergence happened in March 2278. The Anubis Vault opened its gates near the old Mercury nuclear test site, and the Chen dynasty led 5,000 subjects to the surface. They were equipped with weapons I'd never seen before, power armor that made Brotherhood technology look primitive, and absolute faith in their divine right to rule. They conquered a small NCR settlement called Grayson within hours. Overwhelming force, technological superiority, religious fanaticism, exactly what I'd warned about. The settlement's 200 residents were given a choice: submit to divine rule or die. Most submitted. Those who resisted were killed with weapons that left nothing but ash and the smell of ozone. The NCR responded within a week, sending a full battalion to retake Grayson. The Chen dynasty's weapons cut through them like paper. Advanced plasma weapons, electromagnetic pulse devices that disabled NCR equipment, genetically enhanced soldiers who could fight for hours without tiring. The NCR battalion was destroyed, only a handful of survivors escaping to report what they'd faced. That's when the wasteland finally understood I'd been telling the truth. The Desert Pharaohs were real. They were emerging, and they were far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Now, 5 years after I opened the gates of the Osiris complex, the war continues. The Chen dynasty controls 100 square miles around Mercury. The Luxor underworld emerged in 2279 and established a theocratic state near the old Vegas test site. The digital afterlife's robotic armies patrol Black Rock Desert, eliminating anyone who enters their territory. Smaller pharaoh complexes emerge every few months, each one claiming divine right to rule the wasteland. The NCR fights them. The Brotherhood of Steel fights them. Even Caesar's Legion has engaged the pharaohs, though with limited success. Mr. House keeps them away from New Vegas through superior strategy and the fact that his Securitron armies are numerous enough to give even the pharaohs pause. But the war is far from over. There are still pharaoh complexes beneath the Nevada desert that haven't emerged yet. Still god kings waiting for the perfect moment to ascend to the surface. Still armies of genetically enhanced believers ready to conquer in the name of billionaires who died 2 centuries ago. Sometimes, deep in the desert at night, I see the signs, geometric patterns in the sand marking massive underground structures, radio signals broadcasting on pre-war commercial frequencies, surveillance drones watching from the clouds. The Desert Pharaohs are everywhere, just waiting to rise. I walk the Mojave now as Marcus Thorne, not the fourth, not a god king, just a man trying to undo 2 centuries of damage his family inflicted. I share what I know with anyone who will listen. I help train NCR forces to fight Pharaoh technology. I guide Brotherhood of Steel Knights to abandoned Pharaoh facilities where they can recover weapons and knowledge. And I wait for the day the last Pharaoh complex opens its gates, the day when all the god kings emerge and the wasteland faces the full power of billionaires who spent 200 years preparing to rule forever. I don't know if we'll survive that day. I don't know if anything can stop armies bred and equipped for divine conquest. But I know this. I freed 10,000 people from a beautiful prison. I showed them the truth, even though it shattered their entire world. And if I can do that, if one person raised to be a god can choose to be human instead, then maybe there's hope. Maybe the Desert Pharaohs can be stopped. Maybe their subjects can be freed. Maybe the wasteland can survive the emergence of underground empires built on lies and worshipped as heaven. Or maybe we'll all learn what it means when gods who aren't really gods decide to remake the world in their image. When dynasties bred for divinity meet civilizations built on hope. When 2 centuries of preparation meets the stubborn resilience of people who rebuilt from nothing. The Mojave sun rises over the desert, same as it has for millions of years. Somewhere beneath my feet, God, kings sleep in their golden tombs, dreaming of conquest. Somewhere above, surveillance drones watch and wait. And somewhere between earth and sky, I keep walking, Keep warning. Keep hoping that the truth I learned in the archive chamber can set others free. My name is Marcus Thorne IV. I was born in an underground kingdom where my family ruled as living gods, and I'm here to tell you that the Desert Pharaohs are real. They're rising, and they're coming for the wasteland with weapons and faith and 2 centuries of preparation. The only question is whether the truth can defeat a lie that's been carefully maintained for longer than anyone alive can remember. Whether freedom can triumph over worship. Whether humanity can overcome the ambitions of billionaires who thought nuclear holocaust was their opportunity to achieve literal divinity. I freed my people. Now I'm trying to free everyone else before the god kings emerge from their tombs and claim the wasteland as their eternal inheritance. The war is coming, the pharaohs are rising, and the only thing standing between the wasteland and divine tyranny is the truth, and people brave enough to believe it.